Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Krieger for the Kosmos Society, an online community for the exploration and study of the ancient world, guided by traditional classical studies, modern online tools, and our interest in the ancient Greek world. Membership to the Kosmos Society is by application on our website, and it's available to all interested people at no cost. Among other learning activities, we offer reading groups for original ancient Greek and Latin works, whether in English translation or in the original languages. We particularly encourage non-professionals who seek a welcoming environment for learning and discussion. Today, we're here for Kosmos Society's Open House Conversation Series, a periodic discussion we hold with interesting leaders in the study of the ancient world. Today, our speaker is Dr. Maria Xanthou. She's given a presentation entitled Killing with Words, How to Commit Character Assassination with Style. Dr. Xanthou's biography is extensive. I just want to highlight a few things for our listeners. She's a senior research associate at the Resilient Communities project associated with the University of Bristol and a full-time educator at the Hellenic Ministry of Education. She has both teaching and administrative responsibilities. She's taught classics and ancient history at a number of universities, both in Greece and outside of Greece. She's also held a number of distinguished research positions, including at Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, from which our own Kosmos Society originated. Her interests lie within the intersection of ancient history, material culture, and classical philology, and include resilience in ancient communities, epicoric identities in northern Greece, Greek lyric poetry, Attic comedy and rhetoric, the history of classical scholarship, and especially appropriate to our society, she's interested in e-learning. She is a Kosmos Society member, has participated in a lot of activities, and has presented for our open house series previously. We're very glad to have her back today. And I'd like to begin asking her a question we'd like to ask our speakers, which is, Maria, how did you get interested originally in classical studies?
Thank you very much, Robert, for your wonderful introduction. I would like to thank you, Ian, Ellen, and Janet for the invitation. It's always a sheer delight and honor to be among you. Well, my interest in classics started from a young age. I was listening to stories about Odysseus from my grandfather. So this, in a way, spurred me to look into Greek mythology. I was taught Greek mythology at school. And this, of course, feeling became stronger when I got into high school and when I started learning ancient Greek and Latin. And then the decision I formed that I have to study philology in general at university level. This, in a way, led me to the research path and ultimately to the academic path. So I hope I answered your question.
Excellent. No, that's really good. Let's go ahead and begin our presentation. I think you can see your first slide on our screen.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, my topic is titled Killing with Words, Isocrates, Dio Chrysostom, and Libanius on how to commit character assassination with style. I brought together these three teachers of rhetoric, which span like more than 400 or more, like 700 years from one to the other. And my choice to discuss comic invective in these three teachers of rhetoric, one of classical, this is Isocrates, and the other two of later antiquity, Dio Chrysostom and Libanius in particular, stems from my research focus on the performative interaction between comedy and rhetoric. And it is this performative aspect that I would like to address and discuss with you in works of teachers of rhetoric. In general, invective, if we seek the definition of invective, is defined as the personal abuse or insulting of someone verbally. In politics, it becomes tolerable or even an art through its comic camouflage. The humor in the insult lies in its wordplay, and this wordplay diffuses the direct aggression of the personal insult into a game of wits. So in a way, the wittiest succeeds or wins. Comic invective excites the admiration of an audience for its wit, despite any sympathy for a party to a dispute. The invective may utilize pun, parody, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule, but its target, instead of feeling physically threatened or challenged, is confronted with a humorous situation in which the onlookers or the audience enjoy the verbal pyrotechnics. Interpretations of invective have only recently started to benefit from recent studies of oratory's role within a performer culture. In particular, although the connection between invective and comedy is strong, few scholars have explored how invective can be elucidated by Aristophanic and Middle comic characterizations. For example, Koster sees oratorical invective carrying on the tradition of what Aristotle has called iambic idea, iambike idea, but connects it to Homeric and tragic poetry because of the shared conduit of the speech. So far, interpretations have been largely focused on Athenian forensic rhetoric. However, I strongly believe that deliberative and epidictic rhetoric received little attention in comparison to their forensic counterpart. So let's begin with our first teacher of rhetoric, Isocrates. Few orators could be considered to carry less venom in prose than Isocrates. In comparison to his other Attic counterparts, and I mean Aeschines and Demosthenes, the Athenian teacher of rhetoric is usually considered a composer of dull, deliberative speeches. Therefore, when we are looking for humor, invective, and/or blame, Isocrates' speeches are included in the most strange and rare texts one could look for comic abuse or comic flair. Isocrates may have succeeded to go down to history as someone whose prose carries the least venom in prose in comparison to the other two, to Aeschines and Demosthenes. However, his speeches are built on the discrepancy between the older past and the recent past. For example, Philip Harding was the first to note Isocrates' use on this discrepancy between the past and the present. For example, no other Isocratian speech exhibits so many affinities and ample use of the comic trope such as invective than Isocratic on the piece. I must note that on the piece is a speech which is built upon the antithesis between the past and the older past and the recent past. Anne Michelini has pinned out and discussed at length the parallels between Isocrates' civic invective embedded in On the Piece and Aristophanic comedy, The Acarnians. I think I have included Acarnians in your handout, and I think it's the next slide. No, sorry, it's that slide that we're actually seeing. So as she has already explained how Isocrates punctuates his negative view of 5th century ancient history with a series of allusions of Aristophanes without excluding the possibility that Isocrates alludes comic plays or appropriates additional comic material from other comic sources. Let me tell some more things about this. Isocrates on the speech discusses about how the first Athenian League was built and the principle upon which it was built in 478 BC, in stark comparison or in stark contrast with the second Delian or Athenian League, the second confederacy, which was built 100 years later in 378 BC, after the Peloponnesian War. So in the first, according to Isocrates, the first Delian League was built because the Athenians has really won the trophy of prowess, because they defended Greece against the Persians with their naval fleet, whereas in 378 they built the second Athenian League and they took advantage of the other Greek city-states. One of his major underpinning motives is that of the peacemaker under attack. After all, his speech has the title On the Peace. So he makes a case about peace during a war which took place in 357 and 355 BC. So one of his major underpinning motives is that of the peacemaker under attack, the contrast between honest abuse and lying flattery, the difference between the poetry of blame and praise, which we will see in the second teacher of rhetoric, Dio Chrysostom's first Tarsic or Tarsinian speech. The claim to address an audience of insiders and, of course, as a climax, the key mention of the ceremony of parading the tribute as a token of shameless exhibitionism. So let me also enlighten you on this particular motive. Isocrates blames the Athenians because during the Great Dionysia, they used to parade the orphans and also the income that they took from the other Greek city-states, and this is what he calls shameless exhibitionism, because they wanted the other people, the other visitors during the Great Dionysia to see the earnings and also the orphan children of the Athenian warriors, okay, that fell during battle. In On the Peace, Isocrates constructs gradually his persona in the mode of Dicaeopolis, the key figure of Aristophanes' Acharnians. Again, let me remind you that the Aristophanic comedy Acharnians, it's the oldest survived comedy that we have from Aristophanes, starts with the solitary figure sitting right in the center of the theater, in the center of the orchestra, as we call it, and he says a dialogue of 42 lines. In these 42 lines, Dicaeopolis exhibits himself as the only person who wants peace, whereas the others, well, all his other fellow citizens are warmongers, and he longs for his Attica deme, the acharnes because he is secluded within the city walls, and he longs for his demos. He longs for his piece of land. He wants to get away from the city. So again, his wish is in stark contrast with the wishes of his other fellow citizens. So right from the beginning of his speech, the orator assumes the persona, and now we move to Isocrates, the persona of a solitary figure through the pattern of repeated insistence upon the alienation between Isocrates and his fictional audience, the Athenian demos. Again, as I said, I reminded you of the opening scene of the Acarnanians. This is in handout number 1. Straight away introduces one of the many incongruities upon which the play is built. An anonymous, solitary male figure. By the way, we learn the name of Dicaeopolis when we are well within the play. Sits on stage, awaiting the arrival of others, because they are going, to have an ecclesia of demos who are late for a meeting of the assembly. As I stressed in an article of mine, the hero's loneliness and isolation are underlined by the form of the discourse, the long soliloquy, and the reverberate in the use of first-person singular verbs throughout the monologue. Due to the delayed arrival of other participants in the imminent assembly, the emptiness of the pnyx, a place which by definition requires the attendance of many, is stressed by its being occupied by a single person, the hero of the play, which is Dicaeopolis, an ordinary Athenian citizen who sits and waits for the beginning of the proceedings of the assembly. The reverberation of the hero's loneliness through the use of the first-person singular in verses 28-31 in your handout culminates in verse 30, where lies the first explicit indication of the main character's depiction as a crude rustic. And again, may I add that Dicaeopolis presents himself as a person of the land. And it is precisely this which manifests for the first time the play's inherent conflict between rural and urban, since the hero's explicit statement of his loathing of the city immediately followed the description of his rude and boorish public contact, which mainly focuses on bodily functions. Nevertheless,
Maria, do you want me to advance the slide or not? I'm not sure.
No, not yet.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Nevertheless, one should bear in mind that all of this boorish public conduct takes place in a typically civic setting, the pnyx. The urban setting of the pnyx sets off the presentation of the ecclesia, of the assembly, which, comic as it may be, amounts also to a quasi-realistic representation of civic ethos. So this means that the audience, the spectators, can actually watch the weaknesses of their premier democratic institution at first hand. The closing lines of the soliloquy add one final detail accentuating the rustic persona of the hero. He is robbed of his garlic by the Odomantians and cries out, "Oh, poor me, I've just lost my garlic." Garlic was also the basic ingredient, along with cheese, leeks, and honey, of a mashed spices sauce, especially prepared and consumed by citizens of low class. Therefore, Dicaeopolis' soliloquy invites the audience to see the assembly, the ecclesia, through the rural eyes, in particular through the eyes of one who is the only supporter of democratic institutions in the face of lethargy and corruption. And also, please remember this last suggestion for my discussion of Dio Chrysostom's first Tarsic speech. Now, in on the piece, and we can move to the next slide, Isocrates also foreshadows in the beginning of his fictional speech that the audience will reject his unpopular views. This is handout number 5, since they tolerate only lies and flattery from politicians. He paradoxically claims that free speech, this is the term parousia, the conventional trademark of the democratic polis, is secured in Athens only for the worst and most thoughtless orators and for comic poets. These poets expose Athenian faults to the rest of Greece without provoking the resentment that drives honest orators away from the podium of the assembly, which is a theme already featuring in Acharnians, where Aristophanes, disguised under the persona of Dicaeopolis, protests that now at least Cleon cannot accuse him of insulting the polis in front of strangers. Another allusion of the previous abstract of the Acharnians is when Isocrates' fictitious persona describes a ceremony which I mentioned earlier, already discontinued, in which the tribute of the allies was paraded publicly and the war orphans for the year appeared in their ephebic gear. This is the slide that Robert is showing you, is the 82, is for so exactly did they gauge the action by which human beings incur the worst odium that they passed a decree to divide the surplus of the funds derived from the tributes of the allies into talents and to bring it in on the stage when the theater was full at the festival of Dionysus. So in this particular excerpt, Isocrates illustrates the withdrawal of goodwill of the allies and highlights this insolence by referring to the display of tribute money during the Great Dionysia in 82. This act of shameless exhibitionism is registered as a folly annoying and exemplifies the citizens' inability to foresee or to think through the possible consequences of such actions. The wealth flowing unjustly into the city is presented as a cause of both admiration and envy on behalf of the Athenian citizens, although it was soon to destroy the wealth justly belonging to the city. The tribute of the allies is presented as a token of Athenian imperialism, and the ceremony that paraded it unmasks the dazzling public building and festivals as inextricably linked through the wealth to imperialism and eventually to war. Now, a few paragraphs further, in 87, I can't remember if I have included this in my handout, he uses the parade of orphans at the city Dionysia and the public funerals, which were often attended by outsiders, as a springboard to demolish a basic theme of Athenian patriotism. He audaciously claims that the public funerals, the celebration of Athenian autochthonous origins, and the ancestral solidarity can be interpreted as the tangible signs of degeneration. He adopts the private/public, rural/urban antithesis of Acharnians and extends it to show that the glorifying modes of tragedy just like Dicaeopolis' use of a burlesque of the European telephos and the funeral oration ultimately fail in their aim of awing and impressing outside observers. The common denominator in On the Piece, and Acharnians as performative pieces of civic invective, is the theme of inverted patriotism. Aristophanes' hero comes under attack by the chorus when he dares question Periclean war policy. In that sense, both compositions, prose and poetry, deal with a question inherent to rhetoric. How can the civic audience, which also comprises the civic body, be induced to hear a plea for peace that threatens and even undermines their civic identity? As a result, like Isocrates, Aristophanes is using a quasi-historical account to question, unmask, and ultimately demolish patriotic myths and attack Periclean policy. Now let's move on to Dio of Chrysostom. I think it is the next slide. Oh, okay, I have included the previous 87 that I have discussed. I have included in this slide, so let's move on to the next.
All right.
Yes. Now, at some point during the reign of Vespasian, now we are moving to 69-79 AD, Dio of Prusa, alias known as Chrysostom, went to Tarsus and delivered an odd speech regularly known as his first Tarsian. This is oration number 33. In his first Tarsic discourse, this is handout number 6, Dio of Prusa, alias known as Chrysostom, addresses a public gathering of the people of Tarsus upon invitation. The speech was probably delivered in the theater of the capital of Roman Cilicia, and hence Dio addresses a public gathering of the people of Tarsus upon invitation. He assumes the role of comic poet, whom he explicitly refers to, and he treats his audience to loidōria, inveighing against their wantonness and moral decay. Towards this purpose, he composes a forceful harangue by focusing on a coarse bodily noise, which he called rengein. This noise, he claims, can be heard constantly throughout the city and serves as a shameful token of contemporary Tarsian identity. Few scholars have questioned Dio's choice to take up this particular issue as the unifying theme for his speech. However, as the rhetorical composition unfolds, it becomes clear that Dio uses this particular bodily noise as the rhetorical point of entry for reprimanding the citizens of Tarsus for their increasingly effeminate and barbarous lifestyle. In order to introduce the so-called snort or rengein as a central topic, Dio assumes a painstakingly crafted Archilochian persona. So the question is how Dio forges his Archilochian persona. After telling the Tarsians what he will not do, Dio spends the first paragraphs of his speech creating oppositions that begin to suggest what he will do. I also have included the speech in the handout that you already have. And these passages build towards his assimilation of an Archilochian voice. Everyone knows of medical performances in which the doctor delights the crowd with his elaborate explanations, but that, Dio says, is not what real doctors do. In comparative obscurity, the real doctor comes face to face with sick people, touches their sores, smells their odors, prescribes treatments, and lances their abscesses. And just as such a doctor would probably disappoint a crowd of invalids hoping to be healed by a dazzling performance, so too Dio is likely to disappoint the people of Tarsus. Dio next moves on from medical to theatrical performances and recounts a cautionary tale about a tragic actor who, on a visit to Troy, grew increasingly irritated by the locals who were pestering him to display his skills. He finally snapped that they should leave him alone unless he put on a show that they would live to regret. Presumably, this threat implies that he would have performed some episode of the fall of Troy and thus grieved and shamed his audience. Dio warns that the Tarsians should not rile up a philosopher like himself either, and as if prompted by his reference to philosophers, he sketches a quick history that connects classical Athenian comedy. Sorry. And as if prompted by his reference to philosophers, he sketches a quick history that connects classical Athenian comedy and philosophy. Comic performances originally had served to chastise the people for their faults, but they soon exchanged jokes and flattery for such harsh fare. By the time Socrates came along, therefore, Athens put the great man to death because it had lost its stomach for tough criticism. Philosophy inherited from comedy the responsibility for blunt civic critique, but it did not enjoy the protection of comedy's festival license. With this series of examples, Dio creates a map of various performance styles. Having quickly moved through their preliminaries, Dio next developed a freestanding theory of the benefit of loidōria. Flattery can corrupt, thryptein can even imply a decadent and effeminate enfeebling of the body, and only invective, to loidōrein, had the power to reveal our faults. Dio proved his point by contrasting the two poets with whom no other deserves to be compared, namely Homer and Archilochus. Homer praised everything from armor to animals and even called Thersites clear-voiced. Given the bodily associations that will emerge from Dio's discussion, we might wonder in retrospect if Dio is toying tongue-in-cheek with the idea that Thersites' famously hideous physical appearance resulted from Homer's scant but unwarranted praise. In this first introduction of Archilochus, Dio provides several details for his audience, many of whom surely knew almost nothing about the ancient iambist, and focuses our attention on how he not only abused to psogos, but also nobly directed and abused himself first, proton auton psogos. He then mentions two legends about the poet. The first, preserved in a wide range of ancient sources, tells how Apollo showed high favor to Archilochus after he had been killed in battle, calling him a servant of Muses, therapon muson. The second, known from elsewhere in slightly altered form, only from the Nisiapes inscription from the Parian Archilocheon, is said before Archilochus' birth and describes his father receiving an Apolline prophecy that his son would be immortal, Athanatos. With these literary models in place, Dio goes on to show what effects praise and blame have on the bodies and behaviors of those involved. You can spot the flatterer, for example, because he will praise himself first of all, a detail that chaffs against Archilochus' self-directed abuse, and he will take too much pleasure in his food and his clothes, and he will move in a licentious way. Such a person will fawn upon you too, Dio says, being effeminate among the effeminate. As Dio will soon make evident, the people of Tarsus show all the signs of having heard too much flattery. And just like Homeric praise, Archilochian abuse hits its mark. The person who is good at abusing is like a wandering cynic. He is rough, walks alone, testing and abusing himself before others, and he does not speak in that wheedling manner that most effectively persuades democracies, satraps, and tyrants. We are, of course, meant to see Dio in this description, but he makes the point more obvious by associating himself with Odysseus. The man who values loidōria looks upon all the failings of the world and behaves like the Ithacan. Although Dio's description of the snort at times seemed designed to frustrate any simple or singular explanation, the noise serves as a clear manifestation of a behavioral calamity. The citizens behave as if they were asleep, and worst of all, they snort. This sound can be heard all the time throughout the city, even from young boys and well-heeled adults. The snort indicates shamelessness and licentiousness. Anyone who hears such snorting coming from a building would assume it to be a brother, but it can also be heard in every public space in Tarsus from daybreak. The sound is characteristic of people of ambiguous gender, and bafflingly, such people use the sound amongst themselves as a password. And if someone were to hear it from a distance, he would conclude that the Tarsians were the most depraved Phoenicians rather than Greeks, a comment that surely draws upon the offensive connotations of Phoenicians to perform cunnilingus. Well, Libanius, like Isocrates, appeals to the values of the past by means of vignette and ergaia that distort present reality, highlighting the striking contrast with that idealized past, thus assuming the role of satirist of a comic poet, since the discrepancy between the past and the present is a staple difference in comedy. I think we should move to the next slide. In Oratio 38 against Silvanus, schooling issues from the setting. Libanius launches a relentless personal attack to Silvanus and his son, both former students of his, who never paid the tuition fees. Libanius notes Silvanus's limited intellectual capacity, which, however, did not hinder him from becoming an advocate, and his insulting behavior to Libanius by having his son removed from the orator's classics and enroll him for attending a Latin teacher's class. Libanius' vehement attack aims at fathers and sons' due ungrateful behavior, and they rejoice when the orator suffered an accident to his foot, which had him confined to bed while the city was apparently in tears. Libanius attacked Silvanus' son, who took great pride in his muscles, became a pimp, procuring in and out of the classroom handsome boys for lovers, plunging children into vice, ruining households, sharing in the love gifts, and offering himself when he could not find anyone else. Another example of Libanius' invective is again, as I mentioned, the oration 39. This is number 9 in your handout, and you see it in your slide. Registered as a consolation in his oeuvre, a traditional epidactic speech usually written to comfort those who had been bereft of loved ones. However, already in the beginning, Libanius expands the scope and content of the typical consolation speech and makes them more inclusive by addressing those who grieve for other reasons as well. For example, he includes a rhetor who was afraid of a competitor and concerned for his own professional status. In his consolation speech, Libanius addresses the rhetor Antiochus and offers it to him as a medicine, pharmacon, to heal his wounds. The speech shows that Antiochus was quite concerned because a man called Mixidemus favored another teacher of rhetoric and promoted him in every way, supposedly damaging Antiochus' interest. The name Mixidemus is probably a pseudonym, and it is likely, though not certain, that it must a real person against whom Libanius launched its invective. After showing in the first part of the speech the dishonesty of the Mixidemus in many areas, and as he enriched himself at the expense of others in the second part, Libanius focuses on a dark family business in which much is left unmentioned, and his invective reaches a climax. His speech contains the choicest invective of any of Libanius' speeches and includes customary topoi as well as additional slanders never mentioned by any rhetor. The accusation of homosexuality and prostitution at a young age appears in Libanius' other orations and is rooted, I think we can move to the next slide, in classical invective, for example, in Aeschines against Timarchus. Oration 39, however, it's much more daring. Mixidemus is in fact accused implicitly of having caused the death of the 2 brothers of his wife, having pursued the sexual favors of a student of Libanius who lived in his house, forcing the young man to move elsewhere and of playing sexual games with the wives of his two sons. The climax of the invective reveals further surprises. Not only did this man sell the sexual favors of one of his sons to another man, thus imitating Phrenon's behavior in Demosthenes 19, but he also had an incestuous relation with his own son. So far, I must admit that in general, what we see throughout the three orators that we have examined is that comic invective shifts the battleground from the muscular to the mental arena. In that sense, the acceptance of comic invective is a tribute to rationality, but its success requires a stable society with a rough political consensus. When deep issues divide the society and inflame its passions, there is little dispassion for the appreciation of wit. Fanaticism breeds a stony-faced lack of humor. Political humor demands the luxury of uncertainty, suspension of belief, or the appreciation of civilized graces, such as the cultivation of language. And we see that both Isocrates and Libanius taught wrote speeches and delivered them. Libanius admired Demosthenes and his forcefulness, a quality ascribed to the Attic orator by the literary tradition, which Libanius himself associated with effective oratory in all his works. He also shared a special affinity with Demosthenes' theatrical delivery, for which he half-jokingly remarks in a letter that he himself aroused some criticism because people regarded him as an actor rather than a rhetor. However, as it is well known, Libanius was also well-versed in Attic oratory and knew his Aeschines quite well, although he's clinging to Demosthenes. In that sense, his invective is culturally deeply rooted in his classical rhetorical sources. In the case of Isocrates, let me just add before I finish that in my view, I think that his comic sense on the piece is very subtle, and of course, he uses all the forcefulness and the performance that was used by the comic poets of the past. In general, as you have probably realized, is that rhetoric and comedy are very close together, and they are genres that in a way they are combined in an interdisciplinary way. So thank you very much, and I would like to have your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I'm able to put us in gallery mode here. All right. Has that changed the display a little bit? Okay, I'd like to open up for questions for our speaker. Let's see. All right. And I have the first question, okay, as the host. If you have questions, just signal either visually or raise your icon. Okay. Maria, I'm curious, as many of us here are beginning students, basically, of the Greek language. And so when we read authors, it can be a struggle for us to understand irony and wit. Do you have any advice for your students to understand when insults are meant to be wittier? Sometimes we read them at face value.
Well, I think that in a way that oratory for me is the best example to understand wit. In comedy, insult is straightforward. When you read an Aristophanic text, you understand an insult right away. However, I'm not saying that Aristophanes is unable to make a subtle insult. He's capable of that, especially literary remarks. You can see that, for example, in frogs. When you read, if you ever decide to read as a group frogs, you will probably realize that Aristophanes is a very forceful literary critic. However, I think that what, for example, Libanius does with snorting is again an insult which is undercover. Of course, for me, the best example is what I told you about Libanius. About Dio Chrysostom. I think Dio Chrysostom is not as straightforward as Libanius, but he is using this Archilochian figure and how he presents himself like he's a wandering cynic philosopher. And let us also remember that in a way, the first Sophists that were the first who started saw the roots of oratory were wandering teachers of rhetoric. Okay, so the first Sophists knew that you can hide with words an insult, which is, if you think it in a second moment, you will realize that this is a really grave insult. So for me, I think that if you read rhetoric, especially Hellenistic rhetoric, because in Demosthenes and Aeschines, which are the two rival orators of 5th and 4th century BC, their rivalry was really big and tense. So sometimes their insults are really grave. But if you read Hellenistic orator, because those orators were also teachers of rhetoric, so in a way taught their students how to speak and to have an impact on their audience, you will realize the multiple ways that you can use language. And I think that Dio of Chrysostom is the best example.
All right, thank you. All right, good. Any other questions? All right, Helena, let me see. I'm gonna unmute you.
Okay. Unmute. Okay, so could we say that a knowledge of the epoch and the circumstances and the mindsets would help understand better the irony and the invective, etc., because different things are maybe true or untrue or ironic in different eras or in different contexts. Could we say that? It was as a continuation to the previous question.
Well, I'm saying that you can see different modes of language used in order to serve the purpose of humor. You can, that's why, for example, if you read in my abstract, the initial idea of my presentation was this Monty Python sketch, and perhaps we should have seen this first, Argument Clinic. Well, if you go to this sketch, you will see the difference between irony, abuse, and how you can use the language in order to make and to have an impact to your to another person.
In fact, I did go and see the video referred because yeah, I like Monty Python. Okay, thank you.
All right, good. All right, good. Any other questions? Helen.
Yeah,
to continue, I still have a hard time seeing the distinction. For example, if we look at Socrates, between irony and abuse, when I read a text and then Socrates is talking and he's using irony, I really don't see it always as abuse. It is not as direct as, for example, you have abuse in Homer, in Iliad, in Odyssey. You have all kinds of situations where really but it's plain, it's really abuse. But in Socrates, irony is really playing at the limit of abuse, but it's I think it's different from abuse, don't you? I don't know. It's still not clear to me.
I agree. No, I agree with your suggestion. It's sorry. I agree that it is that it's different. Irony is always placed within the limit of a personal insult, an ad hominem attack, whereas abuse is an overt ad hominem attack. I agree with what you said with your suggestion. In Platonic, in Plato's dialogues, Socrates, of course, uses irony, and which is very different from a direct insult. For example, Libanius uses a direct insult and abuse. Aristophanes uses abuse. Menander uses irony. It's different because Menander's comedy is different. It's in a civic context. The manners are different. Well, Aristophanes' humor sometimes is considered more crude. That doesn't mean that he's incapable of making some many fine points and make a shift from abuse to irony.
All right, thank you. Ian, I think you can unmute yourself. Yep.
Yeah. Hello, thank you so much for that interesting discussion, Maria. I have a two-part question regarding Socrates. So, is this Socrates the political opponent of Demosthenes that we're talking about?
Yes.
So, just curious, if Demosthenes was also a famous orator, could this invective against the Sophists be an invective including Demosthenes, in which Socrates, who was known to be more in favor of Philip of Macedon versus Demosthenes to oppose Philip, was Socrates making the connection between Demosthenes being like Cleon, the warmonger, in that first excerpt, versus Socrates being more like Aristophanes, advocating peace? Is there a connection there, or did I overinterpret that?
Well, Isocrates was born almost like in the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, and died almost 100 years, 96 years later. So he lived quite a good span of time, you know, to understand the consequences of the Peloponnesian War and the abuse the Second Athenian Confederacy's abuse of its allies. Isocrates' dislike of the Sophists stems from his own belief, principle, and profession as a teacher of rhetoric. He didn't like to be called a sophist, though himself was taught by the best sophists of his time. Isocrates has developed his own system, educational system, which he called logon paideia, and he strongly believed that the person who knew how to argue well and to form a well-structured argument which was powerful enough to convince his audience had also to have formed a good character in order to do that. So in a way, he thought that the Sophists were professional, let's say, teachers of rhetoric, but they abused the rhetorical teaching in order just to earn money. Of course, Isocrates had, this is a disclaimer, Isocrates had his own school, he earned money, he came from a well-off family, he had a good education. However, Isocrates never performed a speech. He did this once when he was accused, and he delivered antidosis. This was allegedly this was the only speech that he delivered.
Wow.
And he usually composed the speeches we have and launched them as pamphlets among his students and his reading circle. So he was an unusual type of guy. He was a teacher. He has strong political views, but he was not like Demosthenes. Demosthenes was a politician, and he was like a working lawyer. I mean, if I were to see a main opponent to Demosthenes, I would say that this was Aeschines. This was his direct opponent.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you. That clears that up.
Yeah, I think we are essentially out of time. It's noon now, so let's thank our speaker, and then I'll turn off the recording. Thank you very much.